He walked into a small Brooklyn restaurant carrying the papers that would shut it down forever. But instead of signing them, the Korean billionaire asked for an apron. 30 days later, one secret would destroy everything they had built. If you think love can survive a lie, hit that subscribe button, and let's find out. 3 months earlier, Junpyo Cho sat at the edge of a boardroom table long enough to seat 20 people. At the head of the table, his father, Siwoo Cho, was finishing a decision that had already been made before the meeting even started. Then it's decided, Siwoo said. The New York division divests the underperforming assets by quarter's end. All of them. Siwoo ran the meeting the way he ran everything, with total command. No wasted motion, no wasted words. Junpyo watched him work and took notes he didn't need, because watching was the only kind of participation his father had ever really wanted from him. When a young assistant's hand shook pouring water for the board, spilling a few drops onto the polished table, nobody reacted except Junpyo. He caught her eye, gave her the smallest nod, and went back to his notes before his father noticed he had looked away at all. That night, Siwoo called him into his office alone. A single folder sat on the desk between them. Letitia's Diner, Siwoo said, sliding it across. New York, a restaurant asset we picked up with the Ashford portfolio 2 years ago. It loses money every quarter. Sell it. Junpyo opened the folder. A single page of numbers, nothing else. No photographs, no history, no names. Who runs it? Does it matter? If we're closing someone's business, it should. Siwoo studied his son for a long moment, the kind of look that used to make Junpyo feel 8 years old again, sitting on a kitchen floor with the staff while a party went on without him upstairs. His grandfather had found him there once, laughing with the housekeepers over a bowl of rice, and instead of sending him back up to the party, Sang-gu had simply sat down on the floor beside him. Siwoo had never understood that instinct in his father. He clearly didn't understand it in his son either. 30 days, Siwoo said finally. Go look at it yourself if it matters that much to you. The outcome doesn't change. You sign in 30 days. 30 days, Junpyo agreed, already reaching for the folder before his father could take it back. He packed light for New York, a single bag, and at the bottom of it, wrapped in a handkerchief that had belonged to his grandfather, an old pocket watch that no longer kept time. He didn't examine why he'd brought it. He never did. Letitia's Diner sat on a corner in Brooklyn that the rest of the block seemed to orbit around. Junpyo saw it from the car first, warm light spilling out onto the sidewalk, a line half out the door on a Tuesday night. Inside, a photograph of an older woman with Letitia's exact smile hung behind the register. Flowers fresh beneath it every week, the waitress at the counter later told him. Letitia ran the kitchen the way his father ran a boardroom, total command, except every order came with somebody's name attached to it. Every plate went out like it mattered whether the person eating it had a good day. He sat at the counter, unannounced, unrecognized. A server with quick hands and a quicker mouth dropped a menu in front of him before he'd said a word. You look like you've never ordered a meal without somebody else deciding it for you first, Piper said, not unkindly, already reading him. I can order my own food. Prove it. And don't get the meatloaf. Letitia only makes it good on Thursdays. This is a Tuesday travesty. Junpyo almost smiled. He caught himself doing it and didn't understand why it felt like getting away with something. Through the kitchen doorway, he watched Letitia plate 3 orders at once without looking down, calling a regular's name before the man had even sat, asking about someone's mother's surgery between orders. He had come to close a line item. He hadn't expected the line item to have a heartbeat. He told himself it changed nothing. He ordered a second meal to have an excuse to keep watching. A few days later he was back, this time with a question instead of an order. Letitia, wiping down the counter, didn't look up. We're not hiring. I didn't ask to be hired. You're going to ask to help. Everyone who sits at that counter too many times in 1 week eventually asks to help. It's a disease. Is there a cure? Grunt work, she said, finally looking at him. If you're serious. He was hopeless at it, and she made sure he knew it. He held a knife like it might file a complaint against him. He stirred a pot of gravy so aggressively that Piper had to physically pull him back from it before it went over the side. Careful, Piper said. That gravy has done nothing to you. When Junpyo tried to plate a dessert with the same precision he used signing contracts, Letitia took one look at the crooked swirl of sauce and laughed. A real laugh, the first one he'd heard from her. You've clearly never done anything with your hands before. I've done plenty with my hands. Signing things doesn't count. That night, after the last table cleared, she taught him to make her mother's cornbread. She measured nothing, working from memory, and corrected his grip on the mixing bowl without thinking about it, her hand briefly over his. My mother used to say you can tell everything about a person by how gentle they are with something that can't fight back, she said, nodding at the batter. Bread doesn't care how important you are. Is that why yours is better than mine? Mine is better than yours because I've been doing this since I was 6. She caught the look on his face, something unguarded that surprised even him, and softened. You're not bad at it. You're just not used to being bad at something and staying in the room anyway. Piper stuck his head through the kitchen doorway before either of them could sit with that too long. If you two are done being emotionally significant over cornbread, Table 6 wants to know if we're open past 10. We're not, Letitia called back, not moving. I told them we were. Then you're closing. The weeks that followed blurred into something neither of them tried too hard to name. Bowling on a slow Monday, where Junpyo threw 2 gutter balls in a row and Letitia laughed so hard she had to sit down, then went on to beat him by 40 pins without breaking a sweat. An NFL game he didn't understand a single rule of. Letitia explaining downs and penalties like she was reciting scripture. Piper shouting at the television like the players could hear him personally. A hike upstate on a gray Sunday that started as one more outing and ended up feeling like something else entirely. They walked the last stretch of trail in a quiet that didn't need filling. My grandfather used to say the people who deserve the least attention are usually the ones giving you the most, Junpyo said, eyes on the path ahead of him rather than on her. He was the only person in my family who ever noticed me for reasons that had nothing to do with what I could become. What happened to him? He died when I was 16. My father took over everything the following month. He didn't cry once that I saw. He stopped himself, aware he'd said more than he meant to. What about your mother? The photo by the register. She started the diner with nothing. Raised me in the back booth doing homework between the dinner rush and closing. She used to say a restaurant isn't really about food. It's about making sure nobody who walks through the door feels like they're eating alone. Letitia looked out at the trees, something soft crossing her face. I kept it open after she died because closing it felt like agreeing she didn't matter. She mattered. It matters. He turned to look at her then, and for a moment neither of them moved, the distance between them closing without either one deciding to close it. Her phone rang in her pocket, sharp and sudden, and she stepped back to answer it, laughing at whatever Piper was saying on the other end about a walk-in cooler that wouldn't shut. The moment passed, but it left something behind it that hadn't been there that morning. Later that week, closing up together after a packed Friday service, they worked in a silence that had gone easy instead of awkward, stacking chairs, wiping down the last table. The overhead lights turned low. Piper watched them from the doorway a beat too long before ducking back into the kitchen, already murmuring something to one of the line cooks about how much longer they were all going to pretend not to notice. Everything about it felt warm and easy and dangerously close to honest. Except for the one thing Junpyo still hadn't found the words to tell her. Friday night 3 weeks later, the diner ran at full volume, Every booth full, a line still curling out the door into the cold. Letitia called orders over the noise without missing a beat, Piper weaving between tables with a tray held over his head, Junpyo, apron on now without anyone questioning it, running plates from the past like he'd been doing it his whole life instead of 3 months. His phone buzzed against his hip. He glanced at the screen, saw his father's name, and felt the floor of the evening shift under him even before he answered it. "I have to take this," he told Letitia, already moving toward the back hallway. "Go," she said, not looking up from the ticket in her hand. "We've got it." He found a quiet corner past the walk-in, phone pressed to his ear, certain no one could hear him over the clatter of the kitchen. "Si-woo. 30 days was 3 weeks ago." His father's voice was flat, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it to get what he wanted. "You haven't signed. I need more time. You need to come home. The board is asking questions I don't have good answers to. Then give them a good answer. Tell them the asset is performing." Junpyo kept his voice low, but something in it had changed, an edge his father hadn't heard from him before. "This restaurant employs 11 people. It feeds half a neighborhood. I'm not selling it out from under them because a spreadsheet says it should have died 2 years ago and refuses to. Since when do you argue with me about a line item? Since I actually looked at it instead of signing whatever you put in front of me." A pause on the other end, long enough that Junpyo almost thought the call had dropped. "This isn't about the restaurant anymore, is it?" "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. I'm giving you 1 more week. Then I'm coming to New York myself, and we'll settle this in person." The line went dead before Junpyo could answer. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to, phone still in his hand, replaying his own voice back to himself, surprised by how much of it he'd meant. He didn't see Letitia in the hallway behind him. She'd come back to grab a case of napkins from the storage shelf, hands full, when his voice had stopped her cold 3 steps in. She hadn't meant to listen. She told herself that later, over and over, hadn't meant to, had simply frozen the way you freeze when you walk into the middle of a sentence that changes the shape of everything that came before it. The restaurant, the deadline, my father's company. She heard enough. Not every word, not the shape of his defense of her, only the bones of it. A father, a company, a countdown she'd never known was running underneath her own kitchen this whole time. 11 people, he'd said, like it was a number on a page. She set the napkins down on the shelf very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want anyone to notice. She didn't call out. She didn't let him see her. She turned and walked back toward the dining room, past the walk-in, past the spot where 3 weeks ago he'd told her about his grandfather with something raw and unguarded in his face, and she felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold. By the time Junpyo came back through the kitchen doors, nothing about the room had changed. The same noise, the same full tables, Piper still running plates, the same lights low and warm over the counter. Letitia stood at the pass exactly where he'd left her, calling the next ticket in the same voice she always used. "Everything all right?" he asked, sliding back into place beside her. "Fine," she said, not looking at him. "Table 9 needs their check." He didn't catch it. There was no reason to. Her voice hadn't shifted. Her hands hadn't slowed. She plated the next order with the same total command she always had. It was only over the next hour, in the small spaces between orders, that he noticed she'd stopped looking at him when she spoke, stopped finding a reason to stand close enough that their shoulders touched at the pass. He told himself it was the rush. He told himself a dozen things that all turned out to be wrong. She held it together through the rest of service the way she'd held everything together her whole life, through her mother's death, through years of thin margins and rent that came due whether the diner had a good month or not, through more than Junpyo would ever fully know. She smiled at the last regulars on their way out. She thanked Piper for closing the register. She did every single thing right up until the last table cleared and the front door locked. And it was only then, with no one left to perform for, that something in her finally gave way. Piper was stacking the last chairs when Letitia finally spoke, and something in her voice made him stop mid-motion. "Did you know," she said to Junpyo, not loud, not yet, "that I found out who you are from a hallway, not from you?" Junpyo set down the rag he'd been wiping the counter with. "Letitia. Cho. Your last name is Cho." She said it like she was testing the weight of it. "As in Cho Group. As in the company that owns this building. As in the man on the phone telling his father the deadline's almost up." Her hands had started to shake, the same way they had in the hallway, and this time she didn't bother hiding it. 11 people, you said, like we're a line on a spreadsheet you're personally fond of. That's not what I meant, and you know it's not. I don't know anything. That's the whole problem. I don't know when you were going to tell me, or if you were ever going to tell me, or if I was just the most interesting part of your research. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated that it cracked. A plate slipped from the counter's edge as she reached to steady herself against it, and it shattered against the tile, loud in the emptied-out room. "I was going to tell you." Junpyo's voice had lost all its usual command. "I didn't know how. Every time I thought I'd found the moment, it felt like it would cost me you, and I kept choosing one more day. You don't get to choose that for both of us." "You're right. I don't." He had no clean answer ready, no version of the truth that made this smaller than it was. He didn't even know how much of the call she'd actually heard, didn't get the chance to tell her what he'd actually said to his father, that he'd fought for the diner, fought for her in the only language his family had ever taught him. "Letitia, I was arguing to keep this place open. That call, that was me telling my father no. Then you should have told me that instead of letting me find out I was dating a lie." Piper stood frozen by the stacked chairs, tray forgotten in his hands, looking between the two people he'd spent 3 months watching fall into something neither of them would admit out loud. He opened his mouth once, closed it again. There was nothing funny left in him to offer. Letitia untied her apron, folded it with more care than the moment called for, and set it on the counter. "I need you to leave." He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. He stepped out onto the sidewalk into air that had turned sharp with the coming winter, the diner's warm light behind him through the glass, and stood there a long moment before his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from his father. "I'm coming to New York myself." Junpyo looked back once at the window, at Letitia standing exactly where he'd left her, and understood that whatever he'd been trying to outrun by staying quiet for 3 months had just caught up to all of them at once. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. Junpyo's hand froze over the deed papers on the diner counter, ink still wet, when the front door chime rang and his father's voice cut through the kitchen noise. "You bought this restaurant with Sangu's money? Without telling me?" Letitia stood in the doorway wiping her hands on her apron, watching a version of Junpyo she had never seen before, jaw tight, voice steady, refusing to look away from his own father for the first time in his life. "I didn't need to tell you," Junpyo said. "I needed to stop asking you." 2 days earlier, none of this had happened yet. The morning after the phone call, Letitia's diner opened its doors the way it always did, except nothing about it felt the same. Letitia unstacked chairs and wiped down the counter with the kind of focus that meant she was trying very hard not to think, and failing. Piper came in through the back with 2 crates of eggs and found her scrubbing a spot on the counter that had already been clean for a full minute. He set the crates down slowly. "You've been at that same 6 inches of counter since I walked in," he said. "I'm cleaning," Letitia said, not looking up. "You're grieving with a rag," Piper said. And for once there was no joke behind it. Just a friend watching another friend try to hold herself together with routine. She didn't answer. He didn't push. He just started the coffee, and let her have the quiet. By mid-morning, the rush had thinned out enough for Piper to finally set down the coffee pot and lean against the counter across from her. "You gonna tell me what actually happened? Or am I supposed to keep guessing between he cheated and he's secretly married?" Letitia wiped down a spot that didn't need wiping. "It's not either of those." "Then what?" She was quiet long enough that he almost let it go. "I heard him on the phone, telling his father he'd have this place closed before the end of the quarter. Like it was a line item." Piper's easy expression finally dropped, just for a second. "That doesn't sound like the guy who's been in here every single morning for 2 months pretending he knows how to crack an egg." "Maybe he was pretending about more than the egg," Letitia said, and went back to the register before he could answer that. Across town, in the borrowed apartment the company kept for visiting executives, Junpyo sat on the edge of the bed with his phone in his hand, the same unsent text open for the 4th time that morning. He had typed it and deleted it and typed it again, 3 different versions of the same impossible sentence, none of them close to what he actually meant. He hadn't lied to her. He knew that, technically, was true. But he also knew that what she'd overheard on that call, his own voice agreeing to close it down before the quarter ends, hadn't needed a lie to break something. Omission had done the job just fine. He thought about calling his father back and telling him exactly why that plan was dead, and got as far as opening the contact before he put the phone down again. He wasn't ready to have that fight yet, not until he'd had the smaller one first. He put his head in his hands, because for the first time since he'd arrived in New York, he didn't know what to do next. He went to the diner anyway, because doing nothing felt worse than doing the wrong thing. The bell rang over the door and Letitia's spine went straight before she even turned around. "Letitia," he said, "can we talk? Just 5 minutes." "We're open," she said, reaching for a menu she didn't need to reach for, a prop to keep her hands busy. "I'm not here as a customer." "Then you're not here," she said, and the words landed harder than either of them expected. Piper, wiping down a nearby table, tried to insert himself gently between them, the closest thing to a referee the room had. "Look, I'm not saying forgive the man," he said to Letitia, low enough for just the two of them. "I'm saying you don't have to forgive him to let him finish a sentence." She didn't answer, but she also didn't walk away, and Junpyo, watching that small crack of hesitation, held on to it like it was something. 5 minutes, Junpyo tried again, quieter this time. "You don't even have to say anything back. Just let me say it once, and if you still want me gone, I'll go." Letitia set the menu down. "You had months to say it. You said it to your father instead. Because I hadn't figured out how to say it to you without sounding like I was asking for something," Junpyo said. "I wasn't going to close this place. I was telling him no. You just heard the version of the sentence before I got to the part that mattered." "That's a very convenient thing to say now that I'm angry," Letitia said. But her voice had lost some of its edge, and Piper, watching from the pass-through window, allowed himself the smallest hopeful breath. "You don't have to believe me today," Junpyo said. "I just needed you to know I said it." He turned to go, and got exactly 3 steps toward the door before the street outside went strange. A line of black cars pulled up along the curb, too wide for the block, bumpers nudging against a fire hydrant nobody had checked for. Doors opened in practiced unison and aides in dark suits stepped out onto a Harlem sidewalk that had clearly never seen anything like this. One already on the phone asking someone named Ji-hoon whether parking enforcement in this country could actually tow a diplomatic vehicle. Another aide eyed a hot dog cart on the corner like it might be a threat. Piper, drawn to the window along with everyone else, muttered, "Okay, either this is the mob or somebody's about to propose very badly," and got no argument. Letitia looked up from the register, then out the window, then back at Junpyo, whose face had gone the particular pale of a man watching 2 separate disasters merge into one. The last car door opened, and Siwoo stepped out onto the sidewalk in front of Letitia's diner, adjusting his cuff, taking in the cracked paint and the hand-lettered specials board with an expression that gave nothing away. Not distaste, not approval, just the flat calculation of a man recalculating everything he thought he already knew. Junpyo had 2 fires now, and his father was standing in the doorway of the one he thought he'd already closed. Inside the diner, the temperature dropped by 10 degrees the moment Siwoo crossed the threshold, and not because of the door. He surveyed the dining room the way he surveyed boardrooms, cataloging exits and weaknesses without meaning to. "Mr. Cho," Letitia said, coming around the counter, hand extended, professional even with her heart still bruised from 20 minutes earlier. "Ms. Reeves," Siwoo said, taking her hand briefly. "I understand my son has developed an attachment to your establishment." "He's developed an attachment to a lot of things lately," Letitia said, and didn't clarify which. Siwoo's eyes flicked to Junpyo, then back. "I'm here to close a transaction that should have concluded weeks ago. Nothing more." "Then you're in the wrong building," Letitia said, sharp and proud. "Because this isn't a transaction, it's my restaurant." Piper, sizing up the entourage now parked awkwardly among the booths, leaned toward the nearest aide and said, "You guys want coffee, or are we doing this standing up?" and got a look that suggested nobody in that group had ever been offered a diner coffee in their life. Siwoo pulled Junpyo into the back office, and for the first time in longer than either of them could name, they spoke without an audience. "Sign it, Junpyo. Sell it, come home. This has gone on long enough." "I'm not coming home, father." Siwoo's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level, the way it always did right before it mattered most. "You think this is rebellion? A restaurant, a woman, a city that doesn't know your name. This is a phase." "It's not rebellion," Junpyo said, and meant it. The anger drained out of his voice, replaced by something steadier. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to tell you clearly, for the first time, what I actually want. I want this, not instead of you. Instead of the version of my life you already wrote for me." Siwoo looked at his son for a long moment, and something in his face, hurt, carefully governed, refused to surface all the way. "Your grandfather would be disappointed," he said quietly. "My grandfather," Junpyo said, "would understand better than anyone in this family. If watching him choose this over everything he was handed is doing something to you, that's the story working, so stick around." That night, after the diner closed and the street outside had gone quiet, Piper executed a plan so transparent that only 2 heartbroken adults could possibly have fallen for it. "The walk-in's making a weird noise," he told Letitia, already halfway to the kitchen. "And I need help carrying the new shelving before it collapses on somebody," he told Junpyo, in a separate conversation 5 minutes earlier, timed with the precision of a man who had clearly done this before. Letitia found the walk-in fridge humming along perfectly fine and Junpyo already standing in it holding a shelving unit that had never once been in danger of collapsing. The kitchen door swung shut behind her. Neither of them moved for a second. "Piper set us up," Letitia said. "Piper set us up," Junpyo agreed. But neither of them left. "You said you were telling him no?" Letitia said finally, arms crossed, voice quieter than it had been all day. "Tell me again. All of it this time." So he did. He told her about the call she'd overheard from the beginning, the part before the part she'd caught. His father pushing to sell before the end of the quarter and Junpyo refusing. Again, the way he'd been refusing quietly for months without finding the nerve to say it to her directly. Because saying it to her meant admitting how much he wanted to stay, and staying meant choosing a life his father would never forgive. "I wasn't hiding a lie," he said. "I was hiding how much this scared me. Wanting something my family never offered me a way to want." Letitia listened to all of it, and something in her that had been braced since yesterday finally let go. "You could have just said that," she said, but there was no more edge in it. I'm saying it now. A little late. I'm here now. She crossed the last few feet of cold storage between them, and when she finally spoke again, it wasn't about the diner or his father or any of it. Okay, she said, simply, and he kissed her like a man setting something down he'd been carrying too long, quiet, not triumphant, just finally honest. Later that night, alone in his hotel room, Junpyo took out the small wooden box he'd carried from Seoul and never fully opened. His grandfather Sang-goo's watch resting on top of a folded letter he'd read half a dozen times but never all the way through. Tonight he read every line. His grandfather's handwriting, careful and old-fashioned, telling a story Junpyo had only ever heard in fragments, about a young man who once almost walked away from the family business entirely before duty pulled him back in, and who spent the rest of his life quietly hoping one of his descendants would finish what he hadn't had the courage to start. Junpyo folded the letter and held the watch in his palm for a long time before he picked up the phone and called the family's New York lawyer, and asked him, calmly, how fast an inheritance could legally change hands. 2 days later, in a glass-walled office on the 40th floor of the Cho Group's New York branch, Junpyo signed the last of the paperwork using funds his grandfather had left him outright, funds that had never belonged to the company and never would. The diner came off the Cho Group's books entirely, a clean, irreversible, symbolic act nobody in Seoul had approved and nobody could reverse. He carried the folder back to the diner himself the next morning and set it on the counter in front of Letitia without ceremony. What is this? She asked, already opening it. It's yours, Junpyo said. Free and clear. Not the company's, not my family's, not mine. Yours. It always should have been. Letitia read the first page twice before she understood what she was looking at. And when she finally looked up at him, her eyes were wet in a way she hadn't let them be all week. You didn't have to do this, she said. I know, he said. I wanted to. Neither of them said anything grand after that. She just reached across the counter and held his hand, and that was enough. That same week, Junpyo sat across from his father one final time, this time in the borrowed apartment instead of the diner. No aides, no audience, just the two of them and a silence that had finally stopped being hostile. I'm not returning to Seoul, Junpyo said, plainly, without apology and without cruelty. Siwoo looked at him for a long moment. I heard you the first time, he said. I was hoping I'd misheard. You didn't. Siwoo nodded once, slowly, the closest thing to acceptance he had in him that day, and said nothing else, because for a man like Siwoo, silence that wasn't an argument was itself a kind of surrender. Siwoo came back one more time, unannounced, arriving in the middle of a packed Friday dinner rush instead of scheduling it the way he scheduled everything else in his life. He didn't ask for the back office this time. He took a seat at the counter and watched his son work, taking orders with a notepad, running plates to the pass, laughing with a line cook over something Siwoo couldn't hear from across the room, moving through the chaos like he'd been doing it his whole life instead of 6 months. You look happy, Siwoo said, when Junpyo finally had a free minute. I am. Your grandfather built an empire so his children wouldn't have to work like this. My grandfather, Junpyo said, sliding onto the stool beside him, wrote a letter I only read in full a few months ago. He almost walked away from all of it once. He never told you that, did he? Siwoo's expression flickered, genuinely caught off guard. No, he said quietly. He didn't. He spent the rest of his life hoping someone in this family would finish what he started to do and didn't. I think it was me. Siwoo sat with that for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the counter. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost the edge it always carried in boardrooms. I built everything so you'd never have to want for anything, he said. I never asked what you actually wanted. I know, Junpyo said. I don't think you knew how to ask. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. but it was the first honest thing either of them had said to the other in years. Outside on the sidewalk afterward, Si-woo stood buttoning his coat against the New York cold, and for a moment looked less like a chairman and more like a father running out of reasons to stay angry. "I won't pretend I understand this life," he said, "but I can see it's yours, and I can see she's good for you." He paused, the closest he'd come all week to something soft. "I'll leave Tae and Jean behind, to keep you safe. I don't need bodyguards, father." "You'll take them anyway," Si-woo said, already turning toward the car. "Because I said so, and because it's the only thing I know how to give you right now." It wasn't a full reconciliation, not the kind either of them might have written if they'd planned it, but it was a crack of understanding neither of them had thought possible a week earlier, and sometimes that has to be enough. 6 months slid by the way good months do, fast and warm and mostly uneventful, and the diner grew busier every week of it. Tae and Jean, technically still on assignment, had gone thoroughly native, regulars at the counter on their own days off, dating locals, arguing over the Knicks, eating more free pancakes than any security detail in the company's history. When Junpyo and Letitia broke ground on a second, bigger location, Tae and Jean volunteered to run security for it themselves. No pay bump requested, still filing reassuring reports back to Si-woo about working on bringing him home. Letitia laughed the first time she heard it. "You've been here 6 months. You're not bringing him anywhere." "We know," Jean said. "Don't tell the chairman that." They worked the new location for months after that, first shift in, last shift out, learning the register, learning the regulars' names, covering for line cooks who called in sick without ever being asked to. It was Letitia who brought it up first, watching Jean help an elderly regular carry her bags to the door for the 3rd week running. "They're not just guarding the place anymore," she said to Junpyo one night after close. "They built it with us." So they sat Tae and Jean down, no ceremony, just 2 mugs of coffee on the counter, and told them they'd earned 5% of the new location each, not as a gift, but as partners who'd shown up every single day and meant it. Tae, who rarely showed much of anything on his face, had to look away for a second before he could answer. "Our job was to keep him safe," he said finally. "Nobody said anything about keeping the place." "Consider it a promotion," Junpyo said, and that was the end of the conversation, because none of them were the type to make more of it than that. In the kitchen a few weeks later, closing down after a long Saturday, Letitia and Junpyo went through the familiar choreography of side work, side by side without needing to talk about who did what anymore. "Second location's really happening," she said, wiping the last counter. "It's really happening," he agreed. "You know what happens after a second location," she said, not quite looking at him. "Tell me." "People start asking if we're actually going to make it official, or if we're just going to keep doing this indefinitely." Junpyo set down his rag and reached into his apron pocket, where he'd been carrying something small and heavy for exactly this kind of unplanned moment for 2 weeks. "Funny you should ask," he said, and got down on one knee on the kitchen tile, still in his apron, and asked her properly, no speech prepared, just the truth. She said yes before he finished the sentence. "If you've made it this far with them, you already know how this ends, so let's get there together." The wedding filled the diner and spilled out onto the sidewalk. Staff and regulars and neighbors who'd watched this whole story unfold one plate at a time. Chosen families standing shoulder to shoulder with the family Junpyo had been born into. Si-woo and Mrs. Cho arrived early, and Si-woo, unprompted, asked to taste Letitia's cooking before the ceremony started, standing at the pass like any other customer while she plated something simple for him herself. He ate it slowly, nodded once, and said, quiet enough that only Junpyo caught it, "My father would have liked this place. It was the closest thing to a blessing he had in him, and it was enough." Mrs. Cho, warmer all week than anyone remembered her being in Seoul, took Letitia's hands before the ceremony and told her, simply, that she was glad her son had found someone who made him laugh the way he used to as a boy. Tae and Jean spent the first half hour of the reception doing an elaborate, obvious loop around the room specifically engineered to avoid Siwoo, ducking behind the dessert table, suddenly very interested in the string lights, anywhere that wasn't in his eye line. "He's going to fire us," Tae muttered, steering them both behind a pillar. "He's going to fire us for staying, not for hiding." "Then let's not make it easy for him," Jean said, right before Siwoo appeared directly in front of them anyway, having simply walked around the pillar. Both of them straightened up like they'd been caught skipping training. Siwoo studied them for a long moment, long enough that Tae had already started rehearsing an apology, and then said, "Thank you." Neither of them moved. "For keeping him safe," Siwoo went on, "and happy, which I understand was not part of the original assignment." "No, sir," Jean managed. "You're welcome to stay in America as long as you want," Siwoo said. "And you're welcome home in Korea whenever you want. No questions asked, no consequences." He nodded once, the same nod he'd given Letitia's cooking earlier, and walked off toward his wife, leaving Tae and Jean standing there in stunned silence until Jean finally exhaled. "I did not see that coming." "Me neither," Tae said. "Don't tell him that either." Later, loosened up considerably by champagne and the general relief of not being fired, Tae and Jean found Han, the bodyguard Siwoo had brought along for the trip, standing stiffly near the entrance like he was still technically on duty. They talked him into a plate of Letitia's cooking within 10 minutes and a full conversion to American life within the hour, walking him through the difference between a diner and a restaurant, the honest virtue of a well-made burger, the strange freedom of owning something with your own name on the lease instead of a company's. "You just decide to open a business," Han said, like it had never occurred to him that people were allowed to do that. "You just decide," Jean confirmed. "And then you work like hell for 6 months and hope somebody notices." Han looked genuinely shaken by the concept, and considerably less shaken by his second plate of cornbread. At the reception, Piper caught the bouquet by accident, arms up more out of self-defense than intention, and looked directly across the crowd into the eyes of a woman he'd been quietly, badly failing to flirt with for 3 months running. The room erupted. "Oh, come on," Piper said, holding the flowers like they'd personally betrayed him. And the whole diner laughed, the kind of laugh that only happens at a wedding where everyone actually loves the people getting married. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the lights had been turned down low, Junpyo stood in the kitchen beside his wife, sleeves rolled up, cooking together in a space that had once belonged to a stranger and now belonged to both of them. He thought, briefly, about the cold boardroom in Seoul where all of this had started, the version of himself who had once stood alone in silence surrounded by glass and inherited expectations. He looked at the warm, loud, imperfect kitchen around him now, at Letitia laughing at something Piper shouted from the dining room, and understood, fully and finally, that he hadn't lost anything by choosing this. He'd only ever been choosing it. If this story made you believe in second chances, let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.